Crooken Sands by Bram Stoker. Mr. Arthur Fernley Markham, who took what was known as the Red House above the Mains of Crooken, was a London merchant, and being essentially a Cockney, thought it necessary when he went for the summer holidays to Scotland to provide an entire rig-out as a Highland chieftain, as manifested in chromolithographs and on the music-hall stage. He had once seen in the Empire the great prince, the Bounder King, bring down the house by appearing as the MacSlogan of that ilk, and singing the celebrated Scotch song, "There's nothing like haggis to make a mon dry," and he had ever since preserved in his mind a faithful image of the picturesque and warlike appearance which he presented. Indeed, if the true inwardness of Mr. Markham's mind on the subject of his selection of Aberdeenshire as a summer resort were known, it would be found that in the foreground of the holiday locality which his fancy painted stalked the many-hued figure of the MacSlogan of that ilk. However, be this as it may, a very kind fortune, certainly so far as external beauty was concerned, led him to the choice of Crooken Bay. It is a lovely spot, between Aberdeen and Peterhead, just under the rock-bound headland whence the long dangerous reefs known as the Spurs run out into the North Sea. Between this and the Mains of Crooken, a village sheltered by the northern cliffs, lies the deep bay, backed with a multitude of bent-grown dunes where the rabbits are to be found in thousands. Thus, at either end of the bay is a rocky promontory, and when the dawn or the sunset falls on the rocks of red syenite the effect is very lovely. The bay itself is floored with level sand, and the tide runs far out, leaving a smooth waste of hard sand on which are dotted here and there the stake nets and bag nets of the salmon fishers. At one end of the bay there is a little group of cluster of rocks whose heads are raised something above high water, except when in rough weather the waves come over them green. At low tide they are exposed down to sand level, and here is perhaps the only little bit of dangerous sand on this part of the eastern coast. Between the rocks, which are apart about some 50 feet, is a small quicksand which, like the Goodwins, is dangerous only with the incoming tide. It extends outwards till it is lost in the sea, and inwards till it fades away in the hard sand of the upper beach. On the slope of the hill which rises beyond the dunes, midway between the Spurs and the port of Crooken, is the Red House. It rises from the midst of a clump of fir trees which protect it on three sides, leaving the whole sea-front open. A trim, old-fashioned garden stretches down to the roadway, on crossing which a grassy path, which can be used for light vehicles, threads away to the shore, winding amongst the sandhills. When the Markham family arrived at the Red House, after their 36 hours of pitching on the Aberdeen steamer Ban Righ from Blackwall, with a subsequent train to Yellon and drive of a dozen miles, they all agreed that they had never seen a more delightful spot. The general satisfaction was more marked, as that very time none of the family were, for several reasons, inclined to find favourable anything or any place over the Scottish border. Though the family was a large one, the prosperity of the business allowed them all sorts of personal luxuries, amongst which was a wide latitude in the way of dress. The frequency of the Markham girls' new frocks was a source of envy to their bosom friends and of joy to themselves. Arthur Fernley Markham had not taken his family into his confidence regarding his new costume. He was not quite certain that he should be free from ridicule, or at least from sarcasm, and as he was sensitive on the subject, he thought it better to be actually in the suitable environment before he allowed the full splendour to burst upon them. He had taken some pains to ensure the completeness of the Highland costume. For the purpose he had paid many visits to the Scotch all-wool tartan clothing mart, which had been lately established in Copthall Court by the masters MacCallum More and Roderick MacDhu. He had anxious consultations with the head of the firm, MacCallum, as he called himself, resenting any such additions as Mr. or Esquire. The known stock of buckles, buttons, straps, brooches, and ornaments of all kinds were examined in critical detail, and at last an eagle's feather of sufficiently magnificent proportions was discovered, and the equipment was complete. It was only when he saw the finished costume, with the vivid hues of the tartan seemingly modified into comparative sobriety by the multitude of silver fittings, the cairngorm brooches, the philibeg, dirk and sporran, that he was fully and absolutely satisfied with his choice. At first he had thought of the Royal Stuart dress tartan, but abandoned it on the MacCallum, pointing out that if he should happen to be in the neighbourhood of Balmoral it might lead to complications. The MacCallum, who, by the way, spoke with a remarkable Cockney accent, suggested other plays in turn. But now that the other question of accuracy had been raised, Mr. Markam foresaw difficulties if he should by chance find himself in the locality of the clan whose colours he had usurped. The MacCallum at last undertook to have, at Markam's expense, a special pattern woven, which would not be exactly the same as any existing tartan, though partaking of the characteristics of many. It was based on the Royal Stuart, but contained suggestions as to simplicity of pattern from the MacAllister and Ogilvy clans, and as to neutrality of colour from the clans of Buchanan, Macbeth, Chief of Macintosh, and MacLeod. When the specimen had been shown to Markam, he had feared somewhat lest it should strike the eye of his domestic circle as gaudy, but as Roderick MacDhu fell into perfect ecstasies over its beauty, he did not make any objection to the completion of the piece. He thought, and wisely, that if a genuine Scotchman like MacDhu liked it, it must be right, especially as the junior partner was a man very much of his own build and appearance. When the MacCallum was receiving his cheque, which, by the way, was a pretty stiff one, he remarked, I've taken the liberty of having some more of the stuff woven in case you or any of your friends should want it." Markam was gratified, and told him that he should be only too happy if the beautiful stuff which they had originated between them should become a favourite, as he had no doubt it would in time. He might make and sell as much as he would. Markam tried the dress on in his office one evening after the clerks had all gone home. He was pleased, though a little frightened at the result. The MacCallum had done his work thoroughly, and there was nothing omitted that could add to the martial dignity of the wearer. "I shall not, of course, take the claymore and the pistols with me on ordinary occasions," said Markam to himself as he began to undress. He determined that he would wear the dress for the first time on landing in Scotland, and accordingly, on the morning when the Ban Righ was hanging off the Girdleness lighthouse, waiting for the tide to enter the port of Aberdeen, he emerged from his cabin in all the gaudy splendour of his new costume. The first comment he heard was from one of his own sons, who did not recognise him at first. "Here's a guy! Great Scott! It's the governor!" And the boy fled forthwith and tried to bury his laughter under a cushion in the saloon. Markam was a good sailor and had not suffered from the pitching of the boat, so that his naturally rubicund face was even more rosy by the conscious blush which suffused his cheeks when he had found himself at once the cynosure of all eyes. He could have wished that he had not been so bold, for he knew from the cold that there was a big bare spot under one side of his jauntily worn Glengarry cap. However, he faced the group of strangers boldly. He was not, outwardly, upset, even when some of the comments reached his ears. "He's off his blooming champ," said a Cockney in a suit of exaggerated plaid. "There's flies on him," said a tall thin Yankee, pale with sea-sickness, who was on his way to take up his residence for a time as close as he could get to the gates of Balmoral. "Happy thought! Let us fill our mulls. Now's the chance," said a young Oxford man on his way home to Inverness. But presently Mr. Markam heard the voice of his eldest daughter. "Where is he? Where is he?" And she came tearing along the deck with her hat blowing behind her. Her face showed signs of agitation, for her mother had just been telling her of her father's condition, but when she saw him she instantly burst into laughter so violent that it ended in a fit of hysterics. Something of the same kind happened to each of the other children. When they had all had their turn, Mr. Markam went to his cabin and sent his wife's maid to tell each member of the family that he wanted to see them at once. They all made their appearance, suppressing their feelings as well as they could. He said to them very quietly, "My dears, don't I provide you all with ample allowances?" "Yes, father," they all answered gravely. "No one could be more generous." "Don't I let you dress as you please?" "Yes, father," this a little sheepishly. "Then, my dears, don't you think it would be nicer and kinder of you not to try and make me feel uncomfortable, even if I do assume a dress which is ridiculous in your eyes, but quite common enough in the country where we are about to sojourn?" There was no answer except that which appeared in their hanging heads. He was a good father, and they all knew it. He was quite satisfied and went on, "There now, run away and enjoy yourselves. We shan't have another word about it." Then he went on deck again and stood bravely the fire of ridicule which he recognised around him, though nothing more was said within his hearing. The astonishment and the amusement which his get-up occasioned on the Ban Righ was, however, nothing to that which it created in Aberdeen. The boys and loafers, and women with babies, who waited at the landing shed, followed en masse as the Markam party took their way to the railway station. Even the porters with their old-fashioned knots and their new-fashioned barrows, who await the traveller at the foot of the gangplank, followed in wondering delight. Fortunately, the Peterhead train was just about to start, so that the martyrdom was not unnecessarily prolonged. In the carriage the glorious Highland costume was unseen, and as there were but few persons at the station at Yellon, all went well there. When, however, the carriage drew near to the Mains of Crooken, and the fisher folk had run to their doors to see who it was that was passing, the excitement exceeded all bounds. The children with one impulse waved their bonnets and ran shouting behind the carriage. The men forsook their nets and their baiting and followed. The women clutched their babies and followed also. The horses were tired after their long journey to Yellon and back, and the hill was steep, so that there was ample time for the crowd to gather, and even to pass on ahead. Mrs. Markham and the elder girls would have liked to make some protest or to do something to relieve their feelings of chagrin at the ridicule which they saw on all faces, but there was a look of fixed determination on the face of the seeming Highlander which awed them a little, and they were silent. It might have been that the eagle's feather, even when arising above the bald head, the cairngorm brooch, even on the fat shoulder, and the claymore, dirk, and pistols, even when belted round the extensive paunch and protruding from the stocking and the sturdy cough, fulfilled their existence as symbols of martial and terrifying import. When the party arrived at the gate of the Red House, there awaited them a crowd of Crooken inhabitants, hatless and respectfully silent. The remainder of the population was painfully toiling up the hill. The silence was broken by only one sound, that of a man with a deep voice. "Man, but he's forgotten the pipes!" The servants had arrived some days before, and all things were in readiness. In the glow consequent on a good lunch after a hard journey, all the disagreeables of travel and all the chagrin consequent on the adoption of the obnoxious costume were forgotten. That afternoon Markham, still clad in full array, walked through the Mains of Crooken. He was all alone, for, strange to say, his wife and both daughters had sick headaches and were, as he was told, lying down to rest after the fatigue of the journey. His eldest son, who claimed to be a young man, had gone out by himself to explore the surroundings of the place, and one of the boys could not be found. The other boy, on being told that his father had sent for him to come for a walk, had managed, by accident of course, to fall into the water butt, and had to be dried and rigged out afresh. His clothes not having been as yet unpacked, this was of course impossible without delay. Mr. Markham was not quite satisfied with his walk. He could not meet any of his neighbours. It was not that there were not enough people about, for every house and cottage seemed to be full. But the people when in the open were either in their doorways some distance behind him, or on the roadway a long distance in front. As he passed he could see the tops of heads and the whites of eyes in the windows or round the corners of doors. The only interview which he had was anything but a pleasant one. This was with an odd sort of old man, who was hardly ever heard to speak except to join in the amens in the meeting-house. His sole occupation seemed to be to wait at the window of the post office from 8 o'clock in the morning till the arrival of the mail at 1, when he carried the letter-bag to a neighbouring baronial castle. The remainder of his day was spent on a seat in a draughty part of the port, where the offal of the fish, the refuse of the bait, and the house rubbish was thrown, and where the ducks were accustomed to hold high revel.